Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're stepping way back in time to look at a massive, world-altering turning point in ancient history. We're going to be exploring the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, which document a completely dramatic and, honestly, incredibly tense historical shift. We're actually going to watch a nation transition from a direct theocracy, meaning they were ruled only by God, straight into a human monarchy. And understanding this ancient shift, well, it provides a fascinating case study in human nature, our deep desire for security, and the timeless danger of giving up your freedom just to have a king. It's a story packed with political intrigue, massive human failure, and ultimately divine orchestration. But before we get into all the kings and the epic battles, we really need to ask a fundamental question. Why did Israel care so much about history in the first place? I mean, if you look at the ancient world, Israel had this completely unique obsession with recording and maintaining the memory of their historical experiences, especially when you compare them to almost all the other ancient nations. Why were they so determined to write all of this down?
Okay, let's dive into this. To get the full picture, our journey today is going to move from the macro right down to the micro. We'll cover reading Old Testament history, the structure of the books of Samuel, 3 redemptive milestones before zooming right into the dramatic climax with the demand for a king, and finally, what the text defines as the covenantal king.
All right, Section 1, reading Old Testament history. To properly read this ancient historical narrative, we first have to understand its literary genre. You really can't read these texts the exact same way you'd read a modern textbook or poetry or wisdom literature. Over 50% of the Old Testament is comprised of historical narrative. From Genesis all the way through Esther, history is absolutely foundational to these texts. The biblical authors weren't just sitting around telling disconnected moral fables. They were meticulously documenting events that they believed happened in real time and physical space.
Now, what's really interesting here is the stark contrast in how history was viewed back in the ancient world. Most pagan cultures viewed history as cyclical. It was tied to the seasons, or it was just this oscillating, swinging pendulum that didn't really mean anything. But Israel? They had a linear concept of history. They firmly believed history was purposeful, it was progressive, and it was moving like a straight line toward a very specific divine goal. Let's just take a second and let this powerful quote from theologian Gerhardus Voss sink in. He said, "Without God's acts, his words would be empty, but without his words, his acts would be blind." The Israelites believed God revealed himself through both word and event. So history wasn't just a bunch of random acts. The text portrays it as divine actions that were confirmed by prior prophetic words. Essentially, God spoke, and then history proved him reliable.
Moving on to Section 2, the Books of Samuel, which covers roughly 1100 to 970 BC. Originally, 1st and 2nd Samuel were actually just a single scroll, and they cover a highly volatile 130-year period. If we break down the 55 chapters of these two books, we see a very clear focus on 3 main figures. Samuel gets about 17 pages in the Hebrew Bible, Saul gets 34, but David gets 45 pages. The narrative real estate here heavily favors David, which clearly highlights the author's intent to focus on his reign above all the others. That brings us to Section 3, 3 redemptive milestones. See, the authors of these texts weren't just writing up dry historical reports, they were documenting what theologians call a history of redemption. The events recorded are significant specifically because they move a much larger divine plan forward. And 1st and 2nd Samuel contain 3 massive leaps forward in this narrative. First, we have the land. During Saul's time, possessing the land promised to Abraham looked completely impossible. But through what the text frames as divine providence, the surrounding nations weakened, and David actually extended Israel's borders all the way to the Euphrates. Second, Jerusalem becomes the political and religious center. And third, kingship is established, and this whole practice of anointing human kings officially begins. And this brilliantly illustrates the real heart of David's leadership. By bringing the Ark of the Covenant, which, remember, was viewed as the literal throne seat of Yahweh, to his new political capital in Jerusalem, David was making a profound symbolic statement. Even though David was the human king sitting on a physical throne, the narrative emphasizes his recognition that God was the true, ultimate sovereign of the nation. Which leads us into Section 4, the demand for a king. So how did Israel get a king in the first place? Well, in 1 Samuel chapter 8, the elders approach an aging Samuel and make a demand that absolutely shocks the entire system of the nation. They say, "Give us a king to judge us and lead us in battle like all the other nations." Now, they use Samuel's corrupt sons as a really convenient excuse, but the narrative portrays their true motivation as a complete lack of confidence in God. They didn't trust the invisible rule of a divine king anymore. They wanted a visible human king with a literal sword to go out and fight their battles for them. Samuel is absolutely devastated by this, but God tells him to grant their request, but to severely warn them first. Samuel tells the people exactly what a king like the other nations is actually going to do. He's going to take your sons for his chariots. He'll take your daughters to be his cooks. He's going to take your fields. He'll take your grain, your servants, your cattle, your flocks. Samuel's dire warning is that this human king will simply be a taker. Actually, scratch that. He's going to take everything and ultimately reduce the Israelites right back into slavery. And that brings us to Section 5, the covenantal king. Now, despite this incredibly intense warning, the people demand a king anyway. So, the crucial point is how God responds. The text describes God instructing Samuel to grant the request, but he fundamentally changes the nature of the institution they're asking for. It's not going to be just another pagan kingship, it will be fully integrated into God's covenant. This exact moment of failure birthed one of the most important concepts in the entire Bible, the Messiah. In the books of Samuel, the phrase, the anointed of the Lord, becomes completely synonymous with the king. The Hebrew word is Mashiach, the Greek translation is Christos. The very concept of the Christ finds its initial biblical setting right here, as these kings are anointed to lead Israel. Let's step back and see how this all builds across the timeline of the text, because it's truly fascinating. God promised Abraham way back that kings would descend from him. Then, the narrative shows Israel making what is portrayed as a totally faithless demand for a human king. But God takes that and uses it to raise up David, who serves as an imperfect but true covenantal king. And this entire line points straight forward, down the centuries, to Jesus, the ultimate fulfillment of the true, divine, and human king. Which leaves us with this incredible thought to wrap up on. The biblical text shows God taking Israel's fearful, faithless demand to be like the other nations, and he spins it into the very foundation of the concept of the Messiah. It really makes you wonder, how might history's greatest detours actually be its most purposeful steps? That is the absolute beauty of reading this as a linear, redemptive history. Human failure is constantly met by what the authors view as divine orchestration. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep looking for the purpose in the narrative.